The story begins not with triumph, but with defeat and exile. In 1891, when Abdulaziz ibn Abdul Rahman al Saud was merely a boy of around 11 years old, his family's world collapsed around him. The Al Saud family, which had ruled the Najd region in central Arabia for decades, was driven from their ancestral capital of Riyadh by their rivals, the Al Rashid dynasty based in Ha'il. Young Abdulaziz, who would later be known simply as Ibn Saud, fled with his father Abdul Rahman and the remnants of their clan into the harsh Arabian desert. The family wandered through the empty quarter, enduring the brutal conditions of one of the world's most inhospitable environments. Eventually, they found refuge in Kuwait under the protection of the ruling Al-Sabah family. For nearly a decade, Ibn Saud lived in exile, watching his father grow old in defeat while the Al-Rashid consolidated their control over the Najd. During these formative years in Kuwait, the young prince learned diplomacy, observed the politics of the Gulf, and nursed a burning determination to reclaim his family's patrimony. By 1901, Ibn Saud had grown into a tall, powerfully built man in his mid-20s, standing well over 6 feet tall with a commanding presence. He had tired of exile and convinced his aging father to let him attempt the seemingly impossible task of retaking Riyadh. What followed would become the foundational legend of Saudi Arabia. In the autumn of 1901, Ibn Saud assembled a small force of loyal fighters, numbering somewhere between 40 and 60 men according to various accounts. With this tiny band, he set out from Kuwait on what many considered a suicide mission. The Al-Rashid garrison held Riyadh firmly, and the city's fortress, the Mazmak, was considered impregnable. Ibn Saud led his men across the desert in a grueling march, traveling primarily at night to avoid detection and the searing daytime heat. After weeks of journey, they arrived outside Riyadh in January 1902. The city lay before them, its mud brick walls formidable, its defenders numerous and well-armed. Ibn Saud's plan was audacious in its simplicity and timing. He knew that Ajlan ibn Muhammad al-Rashid, the governor of Riyadh and representative of the al-Rashid dynasty, spent his nights in the Mazmak fortress but emerged each morning to sleep at his nearby home, following a predictable routine. Ibn Saud would strike at this moment of vulnerability. On the night of January 15, 1902, Ibn Saud and his men scaled the city walls in darkness. They concealed themselves in the house of one of Ibn Saud's relatives near the governor's residence. As dawn broke and the morning prayers echoed across the city, they waited with weapons ready. When Governor Ajlan emerged from the fortress and walked toward his house with a small escort, Ibn Saud's men struck. A fierce but brief fight erupted in the narrow streets. One of Ibn Saud's cousins, Abdullah bin Jaloui, threw his spear at the governor, who retreated back toward the Mazmak. The spear missed Ajlan, but struck the fortress gate with such force that its tip broke off and embedded in the wood, where it would remain for decades as a physical testament to this pivotal moment. In the chaos of the fighting at the fortress gate, Governor Ajlan was killed. The exact circumstances of his death remain somewhat disputed, with some accounts crediting Ibn Saud himself and others crediting his companions, but the result was undeniable. With their leader dead and caught completely by surprise, the Al-Rashid garrison surrendered. By mid-morning, the Mazmak fortress was in Ibn Saud's hands, and Riyadh had been recaptured. The city's inhabitants, many of whom had lived under Al-Saud rule before 1891, largely welcomed the change. Ibn Saud's father, Abdul Rahman, formally entered the city and resumed the title of Imam, though he would soon delegate most authority to his capable son. The capture of Riyadh was merely the beginning of a long and bloody struggle for control of Central Arabia. The Al-Rashid dynasty, backed by the Ottoman Empire, was not about to accept the loss of Riyadh without a fight. For the next decade, Ibn Saud would face constant warfare against multiple enemies. In the years immediately following 1902, Ibn Saud systematically expanded his control over the settlements and oases surrounding Riyadh. He employed a combination of military force, strategic marriages, and political alliances to bring the tribes of the Najd under his authority. His physical presence was formidable at meetings and in battle, and he proved himself a capable military commander who led from the front. The al-Rashid launched multiple campaigns to retake Riyadh. In 1904, Ibn Saud faced a major al-Rashid offensive. Despite being significantly outnumbered, he managed to defend his territory through a combination of guerrilla tactics and knowledge of the desert terrain. He avoided large set-piece battles when disadvantageous and struck when and where his enemy was vulnerable. A crucial turning point came in 1906 at the Battle of Raudat Muhana. Ibn Saud's forces clashed with a large al-Rashid army. Through superior tactics and the fighting spirit of his warriors, Ibn Saud achieved a significant victory that demonstrated he was more than a mere raider, but a serious contender for regional power. This battle established his military credibility and discouraged some from supporting the al-Rashid against him. Ibn Saud's most innovative and ultimately consequential decision was the creation of the Ikhwan, or Brotherhood. Beginning around 1912, he began working with religious leaders to establish agricultural settlements called hijras across the Najd. These settlements were more than just farms. They were revolutionary communities designed to transform the nomadic Bedouin tribes into settled, religiously zealous warriors. The Ikhwan project was based on a strict interpretation of Wahhabi Islamic teachings. Bedouin tribesmen who joined the Ikhwan were expected to abandon their traditional nomadic lifestyle, settle in the hijras, adopt rigorous religious practices, and place their loyalty to Islam and Ibn Saud above their tribal affiliations. They rejected many aspects of traditional Bedouin culture, including music, elaborate dress, and tribal feuding, focusing instead on religious study and military training. The transformation was remarkable. Within a few years, Ibn Saud had created a dedicated military force unlike any seen in Arabia before. The Ikhwan warriors were fierce fighters, motivated by religious conviction rather than tribal loyalty or payment. They saw themselves as holy warriors, purifying Islam, and were willing to die in battle, believing martyrdom would grant them paradise. By 1915, tens of thousands of Bedouin had settled in the Hijra communities. The largest settlements, such as Artawiya and Gat, housed thousands of families. These communities became military camps as much as agricultural settlements, with the Ikhwan drilling regularly and maintaining constant readiness for jihad as declared by Ibn Saud. This force gave Ibn Saud an enormous military advantage. While his rivals relied on traditional tribal levies that could be difficult to mobilize and coordinate, the Ikhwan were always ready, highly disciplined, and motivated by ideology rather than plunder or tribal politics alone. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 created new opportunities and dangers for Ibn Saud. The Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, while Britain and its allies opposed them. Arabia became a theater of imperial competition. The British were actively seeking Arab allies against the Ottomans. They famously supported Sharif Hussein of Mecca in the Hejaz region through the legendary T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and the Arab Revolt. However, the British also recognized Ibn Saud's growing power in Central Arabia and sought to keep him at least neutral, if not actively supportive. In December 1915, the British signed the Treaty of Dareen with Ibn Saud. Under this agreement, the British recognized Ibn Saud as the ruler of Najd and its dependencies. In return, Ibn Saud agreed not to attack British protectorates in the Gulf, agreed not to grant concessions to other foreign powers, and accepted British political guidance. Crucially, the British also provided Ibn Saud with a monthly subsidy and weapons. This treaty gave Ibn Saud international recognition and financial resources, though it also created a complex relationship that would constrain some of his ambitions. The British wanted stability on the Arabian Peninsula, but were supporting multiple Arab leaders with competing territorial claims, creating inevitable future conflicts. During the war years, Ibn Saud continued his campaigns in Central Arabia. By 1918, he had secured control over most of the Najd region. The Al-Rashid dynasty, though still controlling Ha'il, was significantly weakened. The collapse of Ottoman power at the end of World War I removed the Al-Rashid's most important external supporter. With World War I concluded and the Ottoman Empire dissolved, Ibn Saud turned his attention to his oldest enemies, the Al-Rashid in Ha'il. The Al-Rashid Emirate had been in decline since the death of several capable rulers, and internal succession disputes had weakened it further. In 1920, Ibn Saud launched a major campaign against Ha'il with his Ikhwan forces. The Ikhwan were eager for this campaign, seeing it as a religious war against rulers they considered insufficiently pious. The siege of Ha'il was lengthy and difficult. The city's fortifications were strong, and its defenders were determined. However, Ibn Saud proved patient and methodical. He cut off the city's supply lines and prevented relief forces from reaching the besieged garrison. Inside Ha'il, conditions deteriorated as food and water supplies dwindled. The civilian population began to suffer, and morale among the defenders collapsed. In November 1921, after more than a year of siege and blockade, Ha'il surrendered. Ibn Saud entered the city peacefully, and with characteristic political acumen, he treated the defeated Al-Rashid family with respect. Rather than executing them or driving them into exile as they had done to his family, he offered them positions of honor in his administration, bound them to him through marriages, and incorporated their remaining loyal tribes into his coalition. The conquest of Ha'il meant that Ibn Saud now controlled all of Central Arabia, the Najd region. His domain stretched from the borders of Kuwait and Iraq in the north to the approaches of the Hejaz in the west and the edges of the Empty Quarter to the south. He had transformed from an exiled prince leading a handful of men to the undisputed master of the Arabian heartland. The Hejaz region in western Arabia, containing the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, was a prize unlike any other. Control of these cities meant prestige throughout the entire Islamic world, as millions of Muslims made pilgrimage to them annually. Since 1916, the Hejaz had been ruled by Sharif Hussein bin Ali of the Hashemite family, Britain's ally during World War I and the leader of the Arab revolt against the Ottomans. Sharif Hussein, emboldened by his role in the war and the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate, declared himself Caliph of all Muslims in March 1924. This presumptuous claim offended many Muslims, including Ibn Saud, who saw Hussein as an arrogant and increasingly erratic ruler. The Sharif had also imposed unpopular taxes on pilgrims and alienated many tribal groups in the Hejaz through his autocratic governance. Ibn Saud saw an opportunity. The Ikhwan were eager to march on the holy cities, which they believed were being mismanaged by Hussein. The British, while officially supporting Hussein, were increasingly frustrated with him and provided only lukewarm diplomatic backing. In September 1924, Ibn Saud's forces, led by his Ikhwan warriors and commanded by some of his most capable generals, invaded the Hejaz. The campaign began with the capture of Taif, a mountain city near Mecca. The Ikhwan's assault on Taif was brutal, and reports suggest that several hundred people were killed when the city fell. The violence at Taif shocked the region and demonstrated the Ikhwan's fearsome reputation. The fall of Taif caused panic in Mecca. Sharif Hussein, realizing his position was untenable, abdicated in favor of his son Ali and fled to Aqaba. His departure from Mecca symbolized the collapse of Hashemite power in the Hejaz. On October 13, 1924, Ibn Saud's forces entered Mecca peacefully. Ibn Saud, aware of the enormous religious significance of the holy city and conscious of the Islamic world watching, ordered his troops to behave with perfect discipline. There was no looting or violence. Instead, Ibn Saud immediately organized the continuation of pilgrimage services and assured the international Muslim community that the holy sites would be protected and accessible to all Muslims. However, Medina and Jeddah remained under Hashemite control, with Ali bin Hussein refusing to surrender. The siege of Jeddah lasted nearly a year, from 1924 into December 1925. Ibn Saud personally supervised operations, though he was careful to avoid direct assaults that might cause massive casualties or damage the city. In Medina, the situation was even more delicate due to the presence of the Prophet Muhammad's tomb. Ibn Saud negotiated carefully, and the city surrendered peacefully in December 1925. Jeddah followed shortly after, surrendering on December 23, 1925. By the end of 1925, Ibn Saud controlled the entire Hejaz, and on January 8, 1926, in the Grand Mosque in Mecca, he was proclaimed King of the Hejaz. Ibn Saud's greatest military triumph was followed almost immediately by his most dangerous internal challenge. The Ikhwan, the very force that had been instrumental in his conquests, now turned against him. The Ikhwan leadership had become increasingly radical and uncompromising in their religious views. They wanted to continue their holy war beyond Arabia's borders, raiding into Iraq, Transjordan, and Kuwait, all of which were British protectorates or mandates. They were frustrated that Ibn Saud, constrained by his treaty obligations to Britain and his diplomatic pragmatism, refused to authorize these raids. Furthermore, the Ikhwan opposed Ibn Saud's modernization efforts. They objected to his introduction of telephones, automobiles, and telegraphs, seeing these innovations as un-Islamic. They were scandalized by Ibn Saud's diplomatic interactions with Christian British officials. Most fundamentally, they believed that Ibn Saud should rule purely by Islamic law, as they interpreted it, without compromise or negotiation with the outside world. The conflict came to a head when Ikhwan leaders, particularly Faisal al-Dawish of the Mutayr tribe and Sultan bin Bijad of the Otaiba tribe, began conducting unauthorized raids across borders in 1927 and 1928. These raids threatened Ibn Saud's relations with Britain and risked drawing him into conflicts he could not afford. Ibn Saud tried negotiation first, meeting with the Ikhwan leaders multiple times to address their grievances. However, the radicals were uncompromising. They accused Ibn Saud of betraying Islam by cooperating with infidels and failing to continue the jihad. By late 1928, open rebellion had broken out. The conflict escalated through 1929. The rebel Ikhwan forces numbered in the thousands and were among the finest warriors in Arabia, veterans of Ibn Saud's conquest campaigns. However, Ibn Saud had several crucial advantages. He retained the loyalty of many Ikhwan settlements and tribes. He had access to modern weapons, including machine guns and vehicles, which he had once hesitated to use, but now deployed without reservation. Most importantly, the British provided intelligence and eventually military support along the borders, preventing the rebels from finding safe haven. The decisive battle came at Sibilla on March 30, 1929. Ibn Saud's forces, which included loyal Ikhwan units, regular tribal warriors, and soldiers equipped with modern weapons and vehicles, faced the rebel Ikhwan in open battle. The fighting was fierce and bloody, pitting former comrades against each other. Ibn Saud's forces, better equipped and more numerous, achieved a crushing victory. The rebel Ikhwan, fighting in their traditional style, could not withstand the combination of machine gun fire and the tactics of a modern army. Hundreds were killed, and the rebel force was shattered. The rebellion continued in smaller form for another year as scattered groups of rebels conducted raids and skirmishes, but the back of the revolt had been broken at Sibilla. By early 1930, most rebel leaders had been captured or killed. Faisal al-Dawish, wounded and abandoned by many of his followers, eventually surrendered to the British in Kuwait, who handed him over to Ibn Saud. He died in prison in 1931. The defeat of the Ikhwan rebellion was essential for Ibn Saud's vision of a modern state. While he had used religious fervor to power his conquests, he recognized that unlimited jihad and religious extremism would prevent him from building a stable, internationally recognized kingdom. The suppression of the rebellion, though painful, allowed him to transform from a tribal and religious leader into a modern monarch. By 1930, Ibn Saud controlled virtually all of the Arabian Peninsula, except for the British protectorates along the coast and the independent Imamate of Yemen. His territories included the Najd in central Arabia, the Hejaz in the west with its holy cities, the eastern province along the Persian Gulf, and Asir in the southwest. For several years, these regions were administered as separate entities, with Ibn Saud holding different titles in each: Sultan of Najd, King of Hejaz, and so forth. However, Ibn Saud and his advisors recognized the need to create a unified state with a single identity and government structure. On September 23, 1932, Ibn Saud issued a decree unifying his realms under a single name, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The kingdom was named after the Al Saud family, making it one of the few countries in the modern world named after a ruling family. Ibn Saud took the title King of Saudi Arabia, and the country was established as an Islamic absolute monarchy. The unification decree marked the culmination of Ibn Saud's 30-year campaign of conquest and consolidation. The boy who had fled Riyadh in 1891 had returned to conquer not just his ancestral city, but an entire kingdom spanning hundreds of thousands of square miles. The creation of Saudi Arabia in 1932 was not the end of Ibn Saud's story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. He would rule the kingdom until his death in 1953, facing new challenges in building a modern state, managing the discovery of oil, and navigating World War II and the emerging Cold War. The conquest of Saudi Arabia stands as one of the most remarkable achievements in 20th century history. Starting with fewer than 100 men, Ibn Saud had defeated multiple rival dynasties, subdued hundreds of tribes, conquered an area roughly the size of Western Europe, and created a kingdom that would become one of the most influential nations in the Muslim world. His success came from a unique combination of personal courage, military skill, political acumen, strategic use of religious ideology, and diplomatic pragmatism. He was willing to fight when necessary, but equally willing to negotiate, compromise, and show mercy to defeated enemies when it served his purposes. He used religious fervor to mobilize his forces, but was realistic enough to suppress that same religious extremism when it threatened stability. The conquest was not achieved without tremendous bloodshed and suffering. Thousands died in battles, raids, and sieges across 3 decades of warfare. Entire communities were displaced, traditional ways of life were destroyed, and the Ikhwan rebellion in particular revealed the dark side of religiously motivated warfare. Nevertheless, Ibn Saud's conquest unified a region that had been fragmented for centuries and created a state that, for better or worse, would play a crucial role in global affairs throughout the 20th century and beyond. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia remains, nearly a century after its founding, ruled by the descendants of the man who captured Riyadh with 40 fighters on a January morning in 1902.